A racist and corrupt cop grabbed the arm of a black man inside a packed courtroom and tried to throw him out without knowing a single thing about who he was, or what he was capable of. And it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. It was violent. It was humiliating. And worst of all, it was personal. It happened in broad daylight. A federal courtroom filled with lawyers, clerks, family members, and press. Everyone saw it. Some pretended not to. Others watched like it was a show. But one man, silent, calm, and composed, stood at the center of it all. He wasn't loud. He wasn't causing trouble. He didn't even speak. He was just there. Sitting in the back row. Waiting to be called to testify. And yet, he was the one dragged by the arm like a criminal. You could hear the tension before it even exploded. The officer's heavy boots thudding across the courtroom floor. His voice cutting through the murmur like a whip, "You don't belong here, boy. Get up. Now." The word stung like acid, not just because of what was said, but how it was said. Cold. Authoritative. Filled with the kind of confidence only someone with unchecked power could have. The kind of confidence built on years of getting away with it. And then it happened. The moment that changed everything. The officer didn't wait for a response. He reached out and grabbed the man's arm, pulling him up from his seat in front of everyone. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. The judge froze mid-sentence. A woman dropped her pen. A child whispered to his mother. And the man, still calm, simply looked the officer in the eye. No words. No resistance. No anger. Just stillness. Like someone who had seen worse. Much worse. But make no mistake, the pain was there. You could feel it, thick in the air. The weight of 100 moments like this, piled up over a lifetime. The humiliation of being reduced to nothing in a room built on justice. Of being treated like a threat for existing in the wrong body, at the wrong time, in the wrong place, even though he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Because the truth no one in that room knew, not yet, was that the man being humiliated wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a stranger who had wandered into court by mistake. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a protester. He wasn't even a defendant. He was a decorated United States Navy SEAL, called by the federal government to testify in one of the most important trials of the decade, a case against a group of corrupt officers who had abused their badges for years, protected each other, and silenced anyone who got in their way. And the cop who grabbed him? He was one of them. But in that moment, all that mattered was perception. The uniform. The skin color. The power imbalance. That cop thought he was above the law. He thought he was untouchable. He thought that because no one had stopped him before, no one ever would. He didn't recognize the man's face, but even if he had, it wouldn't have mattered. To him, a black man sitting alone in a courtroom was a problem, not a person. And as the officer shoved him toward the exit, something fell to the ground. A thin leather folder. It landed with a dull slap on the cold tile floor. Papers scattered. One sheet slid across the room. And that's when the silence hit. Because among the documents was something unmistakable. Something sacred. A laminated certificate, gleaming with an official Navy seal. A Medal of Honor citation. Awarded for heroism. For sacrifice. For service beyond comprehension. Eyes widened. The judge rose slowly from his bench. A hush swept through the room like a tidal wave. And still, the man said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He simply picked up the folder, dusted it off, and looked straight ahead, as if to say, "Now do you see me?" But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because behind that humiliation was a history. A history of silence. Of being overlooked. Of doing everything right and still being treated like nothing. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away quietly. This time, the truth would be heard. What no one knew yet was that his testimony would not only expose a web of corruption inside the police force, it would shake the very foundation of the court system. It would end careers. It would spark investigations. It would reveal secrets even the FBI had missed. And it all started because one arrogant officer couldn't keep his prejudice to himself. The question now is, how far would justice go? And what would happen to the cop who thought he could put his hands on a Navy SEAL and walk away untouched? Would the system finally turn against him? Or would it protect him like it always had? You're about to find out. But be warned, this story is not what you expect. And by the end, you'll be asking yourself, what does it really take for justice to be served, when the people in power are the ones who fear the truth the most? Before we begin, here's a message from the heart. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we respect you, and we stand with you. This channel, Plow of Twist, does not tolerate racism in any form. We are committed to telling powerful stories that shed light on injustice, inspire change, and uplift voices that need to be heard. You matter. Your story matters. Enjoy this story, it was made for you. And if you believe in what we're doing, hit that subscribe button and join the movement. The courtroom in Savannah, Georgia, had always carried a strange kind of stillness. Not quiet, no, never truly quiet, but that heavy, restrained stillness that comes from knowing justice is more performance than principle for some. Mahogany benches, tall white columns, and the echo of gavel strikes tried to give the illusion of fairness. But anyone who'd been through those doors more than once could feel it. This was a place where truth often took a back seat to power, and where your skin tone could speak louder than your voice. On that morning, the gallery was fuller than usual. A high-profile case was underway, federal charges against a group of police officers accused of manipulating reports, planting evidence, and using excessive force on minority suspects. It had made headlines. The media waited with sharpened pens and zoom lenses. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation, though no one quite knew what, or who, they were waiting for. Sitting near the back, in the far left bench, was a man named Darius King. 38 years old, 6'2", quiet and composed. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silver tie. His posture was upright, deliberate, like someone taught from a young age that slouching made you look like you didn't belong. Darius had the kind of presence that didn't require noise. His skin was deep brown, his beard perfectly lined, his eyes sharp and tired at once. He had the kind of face that made you wonder where he'd been, what he'd seen, and why he never talked much about it. No one in the room knew who he was, not really. Just another black man in the courtroom, probably related to one of the victims. Maybe there to support a friend. Maybe just curious. No one suspected more. And that was how Darius preferred it. He had arrived early, long before the hearing began, and sat without speaking, without drawing attention to himself. Just him and a black leather folder on his lap, thick with documents, sealed tight. Occasionally, he glanced toward the front where the attorneys gathered, exchanging legal jargon and forced smiles. He didn't know any of them personally, but he knew the kind of men they were. Career prosecutors, buttoned-up defenders, and judges who'd been in power longer than most people had been alive. Nothing surprised him in courtrooms anymore. But he hadn't come to be surprised. He came to tell the truth. Darius was a Navy SEAL. Or rather, had been. 15 years of service. Deployments across 3 continents. Missions that didn't exist on paper. He had led men through firefights and brought civilians out of collapsing buildings. He had done things that haunted his sleep, and he had saved lives no one would ever know about. But none of that showed on his face. He carried it differently, not in swagger, but in silence. After retiring, he returned home, expecting a different kind of peace. What he found instead was a community still bleeding. Still targeted. Still afraid. That's when he started to speak out, quietly, respectfully, and with purpose. He counseled young men who'd been harassed. He helped families file complaints. And when a civil rights attorney reached out about a massive investigation into police corruption in Georgia, he didn't hesitate. What made Darius dangerous wasn't that he was strong or skilled. It was that he had credibility. The kind that couldn't be dismissed with a wave of the hand. He was black, he was brilliant, and he had a record of service that made even seasoned officers nervous. Especially the ones with something to hide. Like Officer Mark Rickwell. Rickwell had been with the Savannah Police Department for over 20 years. Blonde hair, blue eyes, square jaw, the kind of man who smiled only when cameras were on him. Decorated. Promoted. Revered by local politicians. But beneath the commendations was a trail of sealed complaints, internal investigations that mysteriously went nowhere, and a reputation in certain neighborhoods that spoke volumes. Off the record, people said he had a temper. That he knew how to make a suspect disappear into the system. That if he didn't like you, you'd better watch your back, because the badge would protect him, and the department would back him up every time. Rickwell knew the courtroom well. He strutted through its halls like it belonged to him. And on that day, he was assigned to assist security during the high-profile trial. No one questioned it. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows as the session opened. The judge called the court to order. Lawyers stood. Reporters scribbled notes. The buzz intensified when the prosecution announced their next key witness, a federal contact who had served with distinction and had personal evidence of misconduct. No name was given yet. Just the promise that this testimony would tie everything together. Rickwell stood near the entrance, watching. That's when his eyes landed on Darius. His gaze narrowed. Something about the man's calmness unsettled him. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was the way he sat, completely unbothered, like he wasn't intimidated by the chaos around him. Rickwell didn't know who he was, but that didn't matter. To him, a black man alone in a courtroom wasn't a witness, he was a threat. And Rickwell had made a career out of neutralizing threats. He moved toward the bench with purpose, his boots heavy against the marble floor. He didn't ask questions. He didn't consult a clerk. He just walked up, towering over Darius. His voice was low, but loud enough for people to hear, "You got no business here. This area's restricted." Darius looked up slowly, not reacting, just meeting the stare. Rickwell leaned closer. "You don't belong here, boy. Get out of my courtroom before I make you." That moment stretched. Time hung between them like a blade. Darius said nothing. He didn't move. And that silence. That refusal to shrink. That's what made Rickwell snap. He reached down and grabbed Darius's arm, yanking him upward in front of everyone, the judge, the attorneys, the crowd. It happened fast, but not fast enough to miss. People turned. Gasps slipped through the gallery. The bailiff flinched. But Rickwell didn't stop. He dragged Darius a few steps toward the aisle. And then, the folder fell. It hit the floor hard. Pages scattered. One page flipped open, revealing bold, embossed lettering, United States Navy, Medal of Honor citation. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a weapon. People leaned in. The judge stood, confused. And for the first time, Rickwell hesitated. Just for a second. Darius didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He simply adjusted his sleeve, bent down to pick up his folder, and locked eyes with the man still gripping his arm. And in that look was something ancient. Not rage, but something deeper. The kind of disappointment only felt by men who had given everything for a country that still couldn't see them. A country that asked for their sacrifice, but not their presence. That wanted their silence, not their stories. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but they had just witnessed the beginning of something massive. The man they had tried to remove from the courtroom was the key to dismantling a system built on protection, silence, and fear. And the officer who had tried to humiliate him? He had just handed the truth to the world on a silver platter. But none of that showed on Darius's face. Not yet. The moment the folder hit the floor, something in the room shifted, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. A sharp silence fell over the courtroom like a dropped curtain. People glanced at each other, unsure of what they had just seen, but sensing it was something important. The judge's eyes flicked from the fallen documents to the officer still holding Darius's arm. A few reporters leaned in, their pens frozen mid-word. Rickwell, chest heaving slightly, finally let go of Darius's sleeve. He didn't apologize. He didn't say a word. His eyes darted to the folder on the floor, and then quickly away. Like he knew, somehow, that he had made a mistake. A mistake too big to be undone. Darius didn't pick up the folder immediately. He stood still for a beat, straightening his suit, regaining control over a moment that had nearly spiraled. Then, slowly, he crouched down, gathered the scattered pages with deliberate care, and rose again, not rushed, not rattled. He turned without a word and returned to his seat, folder back in his lap. It was as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew something had. No one spoke of it directly, but the weight of it lingered like smoke. The prosecution, sensing the shift, stepped forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the next witness is present in the courtroom and ready to testify. His name is Darius King. Former Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. He served 15 years as a Navy SEAL and is currently a federal security consultant specializing in police ethics and internal investigations." That name echoed. Darius King. And suddenly, a few people in the room made the connection. Eyes widened. Phones were pulled out discreetly. A couple of people whispered. The quiet man in the back wasn't just another observer, he was the witness. The prosecution gestured, and Darius stood again, this time on his own terms. He walked with calm, measured steps to the front of the courtroom, folder in hand, and took the oath with a voice that was low, steady, and unshakably clear. He sat in the witness chair and looked out at the room with eyes that had seen things none of them could imagine. What followed was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was powerful in a way that made people sit straighter in their seats and listen harder than they ever had. Darius spoke with surgical precision, detailing his knowledge of the police unit under investigation, the patterns of misconduct, the buried reports, the pressure placed on honest officers to stay silent, the threats, the manipulated evidence. He explained how he'd been asked to consult by an anonymous officer inside the department who couldn't take it anymore. And while he never said names at first, his words painted a picture so detailed that the guilty began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. When asked by the prosecution if he had any direct encounters with any of the accused officers, Darius paused. The silence stretched, like a pulled wire. Then he said, "Yes. One of them is here in this room right now." His eyes didn't move. He didn't look at Rickwell. But everyone else did. The officer sat rigid, jaw clenched, his face hardening into stone. The prosecution moved forward carefully, asking Darius to elaborate. Darius explained, not with bitterness, but with cold clarity, about an incident years prior involving a manipulated arrest, a falsified confession, and a young man who had ended up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Darius had been reviewing records when the pattern emerged. And the name attached to those falsified documents? Officer Mark Rickwell. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom again, this time sharper, more real. Rickwell shifted in his seat but didn't speak. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, trying to settle him. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The testimony continued. Darius brought out emails, timestamps, evidence logs, showing how data had been changed. He had built a case within a case. Piece by piece, he laid out a blueprint of corruption that reached deeper than anyone had expected. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a culture, an ecosystem. And someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. When court adjourned for the day, the room exploded into movement. Reporters rushed to file updates. Lawyers whispered urgently in corners. Officers avoided eye contact with each other. Darius packed his folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked out without speaking to anyone. But Rickwell wasn't done. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway near the elevator, he waited. As Darius approached, Rickwell stepped in front of him. The corridor emptied fast, sensing something was about to go down. Rickwell didn't raise his voice, but there was venom in it. "You think you're gonna take me down with words? With your little files and speeches? You have no idea what you're playing with." Darius met his stare, unfazed. "No," he said, "you just never expected anyone to speak." Rickwell's face twitched. "You're not one of them anymore. You're just another mouth trying to make noise." "You're right," Darius said quietly. "I'm not one of them. But I've seen men like you my entire life. And you all break the same way." Security appeared before it escalated. Darius stepped into the elevator, leaving Rickwell frozen in place, staring into nothing. Over the next few days, the courtroom became a battlefield. Witnesses began to shift their stories. A few junior officers asked to speak privately with the prosecution. The mood changed. A storm was brewing, and everyone knew it. Darius kept showing up, each day with more documents, more testimonies, more clarity. And while the judge maintained decorum, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Rickwell's defense team began scrambling, trying to discredit Darius's background, attempting to paint him as an overzealous outsider, desperate for attention. But the facts kept stacking up. Then came the leak. Someone, no one knew who, released bodycam footage from a traffic stop 2 years prior. The video showed Rickwell forcing a confession from a teenage boy, threatening him, using language that made the courtroom sick. The boy had been released, but the footage had never surfaced. Until now. And suddenly, everything changed. The public outcry grew louder. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. News vans circled like vultures. Inside, Rickwell became increasingly erratic. He interrupted the proceedings. He whispered furiously to his lawyer. He glared at Darius with an intensity that could burn. But Darius never flinched. He stayed composed, letting the weight of truth do the work. Each testimony added pressure. Each document added weight. And the entire courtroom began to feel the inevitable tipping point approaching. Something was going to break. Something had to. One morning, the court was delayed. Whispers spread that new evidence had come in overnight. When the doors finally opened, there was a different kind of buzz. Darius entered, calm as always, but his steps were heavier, more focused. He nodded once at the prosecutor, handed over a sealed envelope, and took his seat. No one knew yet what was inside. But as the envelope was passed to the judge and opened slowly, one thing became clear. Whatever it was, it would change everything. And what no one in that room expected, was who it would expose. The judge's fingers moved slowly across the seal of the envelope, slicing through it with a thin blade from the bench drawer, careful not to tear the contents. The courtroom, normally filled with murmurs and paper shuffles, had fallen into an unnatural silence. Everyone leaned forward without meaning to. Some barely breathed. The envelope, small and flat, suddenly felt like a loaded weapon. And once it was open, the judge paused, adjusted his glasses, and studied the first page with a weight in his expression that only deepened as he read. The lines on his forehead tightened. His lips pressed into a firm, unmoving line. Then, without raising his head, he passed the papers down to the clerk and cleared his throat. "We'll call a brief recess. All counsel, please remain in the courtroom." Whispers exploded the second the judge stepped out. Reporters fumbled with their phones. Defense attorneys leaned into each other with urgent, hushed tones. Darius sat still, his hands folded. The prosecutor didn't speak to him, but gave a slight nod, the kind of nod that acknowledged a shift, the kind that said this is it. Rickwell hadn't moved. His posture hadn't changed, but his eyes had. There was panic in them now. Not wild panic, worse. The silent, calculated kind that comes when a man realizes he's no longer in control. He turned slightly in his chair and stared at Darius, then looked away as if staring too long might break something inside him. The judge returned 10 minutes later, the court rose, and silence settled again. He cleared his throat and adjusted his robe like it suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders. Then, with a tone more solemn than before, he addressed the room. New evidence has been introduced. Given its content and corroborated authenticity, it will be admitted into the record immediately. Court will reconvene with this material presented by the witness. Mr. King, you may proceed. Darius stood, walked to the front, and took his place. This time, there was no folder. No papers. Just him. Just his voice. He looked out at the courtroom, then fixed his eyes on the defense table. 3 days ago, he began, a flash drive was left in the mailbox of my temporary residence here in Savannah. No return address. No name. Just a note, do what's right. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. On that drive was a recording, audio only. It was taken in a patrol car 2 years ago. The voice on that recording belongs to Officer Mark Rickwell. A gasp. Audible, sharp, immediate. Rickwell's jaw twitched. His attorney whispered something, but he didn't respond. Darius nodded once toward the judge. The court technician played the file. At first, static. Then, clear as day, a voice, Rickwell's voice, laughing, then mocking. That kid didn't do it, but who cares? He fit the description. We need the numbers. We'll fix the rest later. The room didn't breathe. The judge's knuckles clenched the edge of his bench. The audio continued. More laughter. More language that stripped the humanity from the people they were sworn to protect. A second voice, harder to place, but equally vile. And then Rickwell again, saying something that froze every molecule in the air, they don't fight back. They just disappear. And if they talk, who's gonna believe them? When it ended, no one spoke. Not the lawyers. Not the press. Not even the people in the gallery, many of whom had their hands over their mouths. The judge turned to Rickwell. Do you have a response? But Rickwell didn't speak. His hands clenched the armrests. His face, red before, had gone pale. Darius didn't sit down. He stayed standing. This was never just about one incident. Or one officer. It's about a system that told people like him, that they'd never be held accountable. That they could act in darkness and never have to answer to the light. That they could put their hands on someone like me, in broad daylight, in a courthouse, and expect no consequences. Rickwell finally stood, shaking slightly, and for the first time, his voice broke through. This is a setup. That audio could be anything. It's fake. It's doctored. But no one believed him. The courtroom didn't need more. The voice was unmistakable. The context too precise. The damage already done. The prosecutor stepped forward. Your Honor, we request immediate removal of Officer Rickwell from all further proceedings and motion to submit formal charges based on the newly introduced evidence. The judge, still grim, nodded. Granted. Officer Rickwell, you are hereby remanded to custody pending formal indictment. There was no dramatic resistance. Just silence. Rickwell didn't fight. He didn't scream. As two bailiffs approached, he stiffened, then allowed them to take his arms and lead him away. He walked past Darius, eyes locked forward, no longer the man who had once gripped that courtroom with fear, but a shell of him. A man who thought power would protect him, until the truth stripped it away. As the doors closed behind them, the room exhaled. Slowly. Carefully. Reporters darted out to deliver the headline before anyone else. The gallery began to empty. And still, Darius sat there, alone now, watching as justice, real justice, finally moved. A young woman approached him in the hallway. She had tears in her eyes. "My brother," she whispered, "he went to prison 2 years ago." Said Rickwell forced him to confess. No one believed him. Until now. Darius nodded. No words. Just a hand on her shoulder. Later that day, at a quiet table in the federal building, the lead prosecutor slid a folder across to Darius. "We think there's more. That second voice, we're close to identifying it. You sure you're ready for this to go wider?" Darius didn't hesitate. "I didn't come here for part of the truth." But what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was how far the rot truly went. Because that second voice on the tape belonged to someone no one suspected. And once that name came to light, everything, the case, the city, the system, would change forever. The walls of the federal office seemed to breathe with tension. What had been a space filled with cautious optimism just hours earlier had now shifted into something darker, heavier. The prosecutor's eyes, sharp and tired, never left Darius as the name was spoken aloud for the first time, the name attached to the second voice on that damning audio file. It wasn't just another officer. It wasn't someone easily dismissed or quietly removed. It was someone higher. Much higher. Captain Walter Briggs, the head of internal affairs for the Savannah Police Department. The very man responsible for overseeing the investigation into officer conduct. The one everyone trusted to uphold accountability. The one who, on paper, was supposed to be the safeguard. The irony was cruel. The betrayal even worse. Darius leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking into his chest like a stone. He stared at the prosecutor, who waited for his response without rushing him. There was nothing else in the room but the truth, raw and unrelenting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but his words cut through the stillness like a blade. "You mean to tell me that the man in charge of investigating police corruption was the one helping to bury it?" The prosecutor nodded slowly, his expression a mix of apology and fury. Darius shook his head, disbelief written across his features, not because he couldn't believe it, but because deep down, he always had. He just hadn't wanted to be right. Outside the federal building, the news had already broken about Rickwell. Cameras lined the steps. Protesters held signs that said things like, "Truth has no badge," and "Darius King equals hero." But Darius wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He was still at war. Because the real puppet master hadn't been touched yet. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. Captain Briggs wasn't just a name, he was the reason so many reports disappeared. He was the one who had covered for Rickwell, suppressed bodycam footage, and discredited witnesses before their words ever reached a courtroom. And if the system had protected him this long, there was no telling what he'd do now that his name was exposed. The prosecutor paced slowly across the room, rubbing the back of his neck. "We have a choice," he said, carefully measuring every syllable. "We can move forward quietly, issue a federal subpoena, try to build this from the inside out. Or," he looked directly at Darius, "we put you back on the stand. You make this public. You connect the dots. You force the system to look at itself." Darius didn't answer right away. He stood, walking toward the window. Outside, the sky was shifting, clouds rolling in, dusk bleeding over the horizon. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A man with a folder full of truth, a past full of silence, and now, a voice too powerful to be ignored. He remembered the young woman in the hallway, her eyes full of gratitude and quiet pain. He remembered every name in his notebook, the ones who didn't have folders, who didn't get second chances. He turned back to the prosecutor. "We do it in public." The next day, the courtroom was full long before the session began. People lined up around the block. News outlets from across the state had shown up. The atmosphere was electric, not in celebration, but in anticipation. Like everyone was waiting for something to collapse. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Some faces were familiar. Others were new. And in the front row, surrounded by officers and lawyers, sat Captain Walter Briggs. His suit was perfect. His posture calm. His face unreadable. Darius took the stand again, this time not with hesitation, but with purpose. He spoke with the gravity of someone who knew what it meant to carry a whole community's hope in his voice. He explained how he came to receive the flash drive. He described its contents. And then, with a calm that bordered on haunting, he spoke the name. Captain Walter Briggs was the second voice on that recording. A wave of reaction rolled through the room. Briggs didn't flinch. He looked at Darius, then at the judge, then back down at his hands. The judge asked for order in the court. The prosecutor stood, reinforcing the confirmation with preliminary forensic analysis, voice pattern matches, timestamp data, digital trace logs. It was undeniable. Darius turned his attention to Briggs directly. His words were no longer just for the record. They were for him. You sat in meetings where mothers cried for justice, and you nodded like you cared. You released statements about accountability while you destroyed evidence in silence. You let kids rot in prison so you could protect the badge. And when someone like me came forward, you didn't fight me in the open. You tried to smear me in shadows. You wanted me silent. Because you knew the truth would collapse everything you built. Briggs stood then. Slowly. Deliberately. The judge hadn't dismissed him. The lawyers hadn't prompted him. But he stood anyway, straightening his tie with a slow, theatrical elegance. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he spoke. You don't know what you're talking about, son. The word, son, hit the air like a slap. Briggs continued, his voice polished, practiced, but cold. You think because you wore a uniform overseas that you understand what it means to protect people here? You think the law is some moral compass you get to control? This city stays together because men like me make hard choices, choices your kind would never understand. Darius didn't move. Didn't blink. He just stared at Briggs like he'd finally seen the man without the mask. Then he spoke, softly. And now those choices are finally coming to light. You're not a protector. You're a coward with a badge. The judge demanded order. Briggs's attorney tried to intervene, but it was too late. The mask had cracked. The gallery watched as the once untouchable figure of authority was led out of the courtroom, not in cuffs, not yet, but surrounded by whispers and shame. His trial would come later. But the fall had already begun. Darius remained seated. He looked around the room, not for recognition, but for faces, the quiet ones, the hopeful ones. The ones who now believed that maybe, just maybe, the system could be forced to see them. But even as the judge called for a recess and the room emptied, Darius didn't move. Because he knew something else was coming. Something bigger. Briggs hadn't worked alone. And the flash drive, it was only part of what had been sent. The rest was still on its way. The echo of Briggs's final words still lingered in the courtroom long after he was escorted out, leaving behind a silence that felt less like peace and more like aftershock. Darius remained in his seat, not because he was unsure of what came next, but because he understood exactly what had begun. He could feel the shift in the air, the way people looked at him now, not just with admiration, but with a deeper curiosity, a mix of gratitude and expectation. In the hallways, whispers grew louder. People no longer speculated whether corruption existed. Now, they questioned how deep it ran, and how long it had been allowed to thrive. But for Darius, it wasn't about how long. It was about what came next, and who still had something to lose. That afternoon, Darius was called into a closed-door session with the Federal Oversight Committee. They weren't just interested in confirming the content of the recordings or finalizing the legal proceedings against Briggs. They wanted the rest. There was another drive, a second file, one the public hadn't heard of yet. The note that came with it was even more cryptic than the first. If Briggs falls, others will burn. But only if you open this. Darius hadn't touched it. Not out of fear, but because he needed to be sure. Exposing one man was justice. But exposing a system came with consequences that would ripple far beyond a single courtroom. He sat in the federal building's briefing room across from a panel of stern faces, each of them carrying decades of bureaucratic armor. One of them, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a precise voice, leaned forward. "Mr. King, we understand the implications of what's already been revealed. But this second drive, it could trigger investigations at the state level. Judges. DAs. Sheriffs. Are you prepared for what that means?" Darius stared at her for a long moment, then spoke without hesitation. "Am I prepared to tell the truth? Yes. Am I prepared for the damage that truth will cause? No. But we're long past the point of pretending this rot started and stopped with Briggs." The file was played that night in front of a select panel. It wasn't just audio this time. It was video. Grainy, bodycam footage, not of violence, but of meetings. Secret conversations. A judge laughing with Briggs. A district attorney nodding as evidence was discarded. A sheriff shaking hands over sealed envelopes. Money changed hands. Favors were promised. And in the middle of it all was a list, names of officers promoted not for merit, but for silence. Darius watched it with a kind of numbness that didn't dull the pain, only delayed it. He had always believed the truth was buried deep. But now he saw how many hands had worked to keep it hidden. The panel was silent afterward. No comments. No reaction. Just a grim acknowledgement of what had to be done. They asked Darius what he wanted. What his demands were. He looked at them and said only this: don't cover it up. Don't bury it in review boards and policy updates. Let the people see it. All of it. One of the panelists shook his head slowly. If we go public, this won't just bring down Savannah PD. It could fracture half the legal infrastructure in this state. Darius leaned forward. Then maybe it needs to break before it can be rebuilt. News of the second file began to leak within days. Anonymous sources fed bits of information to local media. The story was no longer just about one rogue officer or one corrupt captain. It was a system-wide collapse, and people wanted answers. The mayor called for an emergency press conference, promising full cooperation. Community leaders flooded town halls demanding immediate resignations. Protests intensified, now with a sharper edge, not just cries for justice, but chants naming those whose faces were shown in the footage. Judges began stepping down. One DA issued a statement denying involvement, only to resign 2 days later when more footage surfaced showing him in a closed-door meeting with Briggs. The city was unraveling. And through it all, Darius kept moving. He met with advocacy groups, spoke with families who'd lost sons and daughters to false charges, sat with young public defenders trying to make sense of the cases they had lost. He wasn't a politician. He didn't want a title. But people began to treat him like a leader, not because he had asked for it, but because he had done what no one else had dared. He exposed the truth, even when it pointed directly at the most powerful people in the room. But not everyone celebrated him. As the walls closed in around the system, those who still had something to lose began to strike back. Anonymous threats filled his inbox. Surveillance teams reported suspicious cars near his residence. One night, a brick shattered his apartment window with a note attached: "Heroes don't live long." He didn't flinch. He changed locations. Increased security. But the threats didn't scare him. What scared him was the growing pressure to compromise. Officials now wanted to strike a deal. They offered to launch a public reform commission, expedite convictions against Briggs and his circle, and even fund community initiatives, but only if the rest of the footage stayed sealed. Let the system heal itself, one high-ranking official told him. We don't need to destroy it to fix it. That offer haunted him. Because part of him wanted to believe it. Part of him was tired, of cameras, of interrogations, of always having to prove what should have been obvious. Maybe partial justice was better than none. Maybe preserving some part of the institution would protect the people who needed it most. But he knew that was a lie. He had been lied to before. And every time the truth had been diluted, someone else had paid the price. The weight of that choice followed him everywhere. Even in solitude, he felt the pressure mounting. Then one night, he received a message. Not a threat, not this time. It was a video call from an old friend. Marcus, a fellow SEAL, someone he hadn't seen in years. They had bled together in a desert halfway across the world. Marcus had heard about everything. You doing okay? He asked. Darius didn't answer immediately. Marcus leaned in. I saw what they're offering you. They're scared. You've got them by the throat, man. You really thinking about letting them walk? Darius closed his eyes. I don't want to destroy something just to prove a point. But I also don't want to lie to these people. Not again. Marcus nodded slowly. I get it. But you already know this. If you let them bury any of this, it's only a matter of time before it grows back. And the next kid won't be as lucky as you. They'll disappear like all the others. That was all it took. Darius stood the next morning in front of a packed city council and a dozen cameras, holding the final drive in his hand. He didn't wait for permission. He played it all. No redactions. No edits. The people saw everything. Faces, voices, transactions. Years of collusion laid bare in a 10-minute reel that would become the most watched video in state history. And when it ended, he looked at the crowd, at the officials who had tried to quiet him, and he spoke with a calm fierceness. You asked if I wanted revenge. I don't. I want repair. I want to know that the next time a black man walks into a courtroom, he's seen for who he is, not who they assume him to be. I want systems that work not because they're scared of exposure, but because they remember they serve the people. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the silence of realization. The silence of a system forced to reckon with its reflection. But the fight wasn't over. Because while many cheered him, others watched with quiet rage. And someone, somewhere in that room, wasn't ready to let go of control. The final blow hadn't landed yet. And Darius would soon find himself face to face with the person who had orchestrated it all from the beginning. The question was, would the truth be enough to survive what came next? The city of Savannah was no longer the same. The ripple effect of Darius's decision had shattered any illusion of stability left within its walls. Government buildings were flanked by protesters every morning, courthouse steps were turned into stages for activists and victims alike, and the media no longer spoke in speculation, they spoke in certainties. People who had once avoided taking sides now had no choice. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was everywhere. In newspapers, on screens, in voices raised in community centers and crowded barbershops. But beneath the surface of all the visible change, something darker stirred. Resistance. Not in the open, no one was foolish enough to defend corruption outright anymore, but in whispers. In quiet, dangerous meetings behind closed doors where power had not yet been stripped away. Darius began to feel the difference in the way people approached him. There were those who embraced him with admiration, thanking him for being the voice they never had. There were families of victims who clung to his presence like a lighthouse in a storm. But there were others who came with caution, some with thinly veiled resentment, others with fear disguised as advice. Former colleagues, old friends from the Navy, local officials, people he once trusted now tiptoed around him. You've done more than anyone expected, one man told him at a community fundraiser. But don't push too far. They're cornered now. And cornered men strike back harder. Darius nodded, not out of agreement, but because he had already felt the strike begin. It started with the press, subtly at first. An anonymous article questioning his credibility, misrepresenting details of his past deployments. Then came the online campaigns, ghost accounts trying to frame him as an extremist, a man obsessed with tearing down institutions. Darius didn't respond. He knew better than to fight shadows. But he also knew these shadows were being cast by someone still powerful enough to reach him. He just didn't know who. Not yet. One night, after a long council session where Darius had pushed for the appointment of an independent review board made up of civilians instead of retired law enforcement, he received a call. It came from a number that wasn't saved in his phone, but it wasn't unfamiliar. He answered without speaking. The voice on the other end was smooth, deep, practiced. "You're not afraid of much, are you, Mr. King?" Darius didn't reply. The voice continued. "You've dismantled the house. Very impressive. But you forgot something. The foundation's still mine." A pause. "I'd like to meet. Not in court. Not with cameras. Just you and me. Let's talk like men." There was something in the voice that chilled him, not because it threatened violence, but because it didn't need to. It was confident. Unrushed. The tone of someone who had operated in darkness for so long. Exposure wasn't a fear, it was a game. Darius hung up without replying. He didn't have to ask who it was. He knew. Judge Harold Emerson. A man whose name hadn't yet surfaced in the files, whose face hadn't been caught on camera. But someone who had been there, always. Presiding over trials that buried innocent men, signing off on warrants built on falsified evidence, accepting testimonies he knew were coerced. The name had never appeared in writing. But everyone knew. The next morning, an envelope arrived at Darius's temporary office. No return address. Inside was a single photo, grainy surveillance footage of his sister walking out of a grocery store with her son. On the back, in red ink, "You're not the only one with something to protect." Darius sat still for a long time, staring at the image. He didn't panic. He didn't run. But something inside him shifted. He had always known the cost of truth. But now it had a face. A family. A consequence he hadn't prepared for. And still, he didn't back down. That evening, he sent a message to Emerson through one of the remaining intermediaries. 3 words, "Let's do this." The location was set for a private property outside the city, an abandoned estate once owned by a former judge. Symbolic, maybe. Or convenient. Either way, Darius arrived alone. No security. No press. Just a small body camera under his collar and a resolve that had been forged not through anger, but purpose. Emerson was already there, standing by a long wooden table, dressed in a light gray suit, sipping whiskey like he was hosting a dinner party. He smiled when he saw Darius, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You've caused quite a storm," he said, gesturing for Darius to sit. Darius remained standing. Emerson didn't mind. "I wanted to meet because I think you're smarter than the average crusader. You're measured. You understand that sometimes you have to choose between order and chaos." Darius kept his gaze locked. "What you call order is a system that chews people up and silences them. And what you call chaos is just the sound of those people finally being heard." Emerson chuckled, swirling his glass. "That idealism's beautiful. Dangerous, but beautiful. But let's not pretend we're not both aware of the stakes. You've exposed a lot. More than anyone thought possible. But if you push further, this city will burn. I'm not threatening you. I'm simply stating the outcome. You've already seen what people are willing to do to protect what's theirs." Darius stepped closer. You think fear will stop me? That because you threaten my family, I'll fold. Emerson set his glass down gently. I didn't make that threat. But I didn't stop it either. Because this is bigger than right or wrong now. This is about control. About stability. And people don't want justice, Darius. They want peace. They want to go to sleep at night believing the world makes sense. Even if it doesn't. Darius's voice dropped, low and precise. Then maybe it's time they wake up. A long silence followed. Emerson's smile faded. For the first time, his voice cracked just slightly. You won't win this. You might win the people, the protests, the headlines. But this system? It's centuries old. And men like me, we don't disappear. We adapt. Darius leaned forward, eyes burning not with rage, but with something deeper. Conviction. Then maybe it's time we build something that doesn't let men like you adapt. He turned and walked out without another word. Emerson didn't call after him. He didn't need to. The lines had been drawn. The next move was already in motion. Back in the city, the final phase of the investigation began. Warrants were issued. More officials were placed under scrutiny. But Darius knew the next part would be the hardest, convincing a broken community to believe in rebuilding. He met with youth leaders, local churches, educators, people who had lost faith long before his name was ever known. He told them the truth wouldn't save them, but it would give them a place to start. And late one night, alone again in his apartment, Darius opened an envelope addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter. They will come for you again. Not with violence. With distraction. With offers. They will praise your fight while trying to erase its meaning. Stay sharp. They don't fear the fire, they fear the spark. No signature. Just those words. And Darius sat for a long time staring at them, knowing what they meant. The hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. The hardest part was protecting it after it had been exposed. And he wasn't done yet. Because the final blow hadn't landed. And somewhere, in the last remaining shadows of that fractured system, someone was still watching. Still waiting. Still believing that power could outlive truth. They were wrong. The city hadn't slept in weeks. Lights burned through the nights in offices once sealed by silence, and every building that had stood untouchable before now felt fragile, vulnerable. Darius had become a figure larger than he ever intended to be. His face was no longer just in courtrooms or community centers, it was on murals, magazine covers, news broadcasts. People treated him like a symbol. But every time someone called him a hero, a part of him tensed. Because he knew symbols were easy to praise when they weren't human. And he was still human. Still carrying the weight of names, of truths, of people who couldn't stand beside him anymore because the cost had already been paid, sometimes with years, sometimes with lives. He walked the streets differently now. Not because of fear, but because of awareness. He could feel the tension returning, not in the form of resistance from those already exposed, but in the silence of those who still hadn't been. The most dangerous ones weren't the loud deniers, they were the quiet watchers, the ones who waited to reclaim control when the storm passed. One evening, after leaving a closed-door meeting with the Federal Oversight Board, Darius found himself walking alone through a narrow corridor behind the courthouse. It was quiet, dark except for the glow of street lamps casting long, distorted shadows. A man stepped out from behind a pillar, tall, composed, wearing a plain coat with no badge, no ID. Darius stopped, ready, but not startled. The man spoke low, deliberate. There's a file you haven't seen. Not because it's hidden, because it was never entered into the system. It's physical. Off-grid. And it's the last thread. Pull it, and everything unravels. Darius didn't ask who he was. He just asked where. The man handed him a slip of paper with an address and disappeared down the corridor without another word. It felt surreal, theatrical even, but Darius had been in war zones where truth came in stranger forms. The next morning, he followed the lead. It brought him to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, old, rusted, forgotten. He signed in under a fake name, followed the hallway, and found a small unit with a lock that had already been broken. Inside was a single box. Not a pile. Not a vault. Just one box, taped and labeled in black marker, Case 0, Briggs/Emerson/Archive A. He carried it back to his temporary residence and didn't open it for hours. He sat with it. Let the weight of it sit on him first. When he finally tore the tape and opened the lid, what he found wasn't shocking, it was devastating in its simplicity. Handwritten notes, old memos, letters between officials detailing how to bury early complaints, how to turn witnesses against each other, how to fabricate timestamps and adjust body cam data. The names included judges, city managers, even a former mayor. And beneath it all was a list, a long one, of dismissed complaints filed over the last 15 years, all marked with the same symbol in the corner, a faded red check. Victims who were never heard, never helped, never believed. He ran his finger down the list and stopped when he reached a name he recognized. It wasn't someone famous. It was a teenager. A boy Darius had spoken to once in a community outreach group 2 years ago. The kid had disappeared a few weeks later. No explanation. Just gone. Darius closed the box and sat back, numb. The truth wasn't just buried. It had been catalogued. Sanitized. It wasn't chaos. It was design. The following day, Darius brought the box to the U.S. Attorney's office. The room was packed with federal investigators, representatives from the Department of Justice, and legal analysts who had flown in from D.C. A woman named Marisol Vega, one of the senior federal prosecutors, opened the files first. Her hand stopped halfway through the second document. Her voice was calm, but her eyes didn't lift. This rewrites the entire narrative. This doesn't just convict people, it exposes intent at the highest levels. Darius nodded. Then it has to be seen. All of it. But not everyone in that room agreed. One man, a deputy director, leaned forward and said, "If we release this, we're not just talking state fallout. We're talking federal resignations, congressional inquiries, complete destabilization of trust in public institutions. Are you ready to light that fuse?" Darius looked at him, measured, and said, "The fuse was lit a long time ago. I'm just making sure people stop pretending it isn't burning." They tried to stall him. Suggested delay. Review boards. A phased release. But Darius knew what delay really meant. It meant negotiation. It meant compromise. It meant watering down the truth until it no longer had the power to convict. So he left the room, took the files, and walked directly to a broadcast studio that had been covering the case from the beginning. Within an hour, the footage of him walking in with the box aired live across the country. No leaks this time. No rumors. Just clarity. He sat across from the anchor, held up the list, and said, "These are the names. This is what they did. And here's what happens next." The fallout was immediate. Arrests. Indictments. Resignations. Emerson vanished from public view within 24 hours. His home was surrounded by federal agents by morning. But still, Darius couldn't shake the weight of it. Because even as systems crumbled and charges were filed, he couldn't forget the names on the list. The ones who wouldn't get a second chance. The ones no courtroom would bring back. He walked the neighborhoods more often now, not as a symbol, but as a reminder, that justice wasn't a press conference. It was a daily act. And every time he looked someone in the eye and saw belief return, even a flicker, he knew it was worth it. One evening, after a community meeting, a teenage boy approached him. Quiet. Nervous. He held a crumpled paper in his hand. My brother, he was one of them, he said. On the list. Nobody believed him. They said he made it up. But you proved he wasn't lying. Darius took the paper, unfolded it. It was a photocopy of an old complaint form. Dismissed. Red check in the corner. Darius looked at the boy, his voice low. He was never lying. And neither are you. The boy nodded, tears building but not falling. And in that moment, Darius understood the fight wasn't just about institutions. It was about restoring something much harder to repair, trust. But behind the scenes, the final echo of the system's resistance stirred. One last push. Because somewhere deep in the government, plans were being made, to discredit, to divide, to distract. And one of those plans had Darius's name on it. Files were pulled. Old missions reviewed. An incident during his final tour overseas, something classified, was being repackaged, twisted into a narrative of instability. They were trying to turn the hero into a liability. The Whisper campaign began again, this time from places of power, not shadows. And yet, Darius didn't flinch. He called a press conference, stood in front of the cameras, and addressed it head-on. There will always be people who try to redefine you, to reshape your legacy into something convenient for them. I've never claimed to be perfect. I've made mistakes. But I've never betrayed the truth. And I never will. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in something deeper, respect. The kind of respect that can't be manufactured. The kind that only comes when someone chooses principle over preservation. As the night fell on Savannah, and the city moved toward what would soon be the most consequential trial in its modern history, Darius stood once more where it all began, outside the courthouse, alone. He looked up at the building that had once tried to erase him, that had allowed a man like Rickwell to lay hands on him without hesitation. And now, it was the very place where the truth had taken root. But he knew it wasn't over. Because for every system that falls, another waits to rise. The final reckoning hadn't arrived yet. But it was close. And this time, it would change everything. The trial that followed became one of the most televised and scrutinized legal proceedings in recent American history. The courtroom was transformed into a battleground for truth and legacy, a stage where power, once protected by silence, was finally put under oath. Emerson sat at the defense table not as a judge, not as an architect of law, but as a man cornered by the very system he had twisted for decades. The evidence was irrefutable. The recordings, the memos, the eyewitnesses, and most of all, the undeniable consistency of the red-checked files painted a damning portrait. His legal team fought hard, resorting to delay tactics, technical challenges, even attempting to claim compromised mental health. But it wasn't enough. The jury, diverse and deliberate, returned a unanimous guilty verdict on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power under color of law. Walter Briggs, once revered as a disciplined enforcer of policy, had his badge stripped and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. What shocked many wasn't just the charges, but the courtroom's reaction when he tried to apologize. There was no applause. No anger. Just silence. The kind of silence that didn't need to forgive because the truth had already passed its judgment. Rickwell, already in custody, had turned state's evidence in a last-ditch attempt to reduce his sentence. His cooperation came too late to save him, but it exposed several other officers who were still under the radar. He was placed in protective custody, isolated from those he once called his brothers. Powerless. Forgotten. But the most unexpected fallout wasn't inside the court. It came from within the community itself. As the walls of institutional injustice collapsed, space was made for new voices to rise. Independent commissions were no longer temporary measures. Civilian review boards gained real authority, with funding and legal backing. Grassroots legal defense teams emerged, some led by families who had once sat in courtrooms filled with pain, now armed with knowledge, organization, and purpose. Schools that had been neglected for decades began receiving funds previously funneled into over-policing. The transformation wasn't just policy, it was personal. And at the center of it all stood Darius King. He never claimed victory. He never took credit alone. But his presence remained undeniable. He declined offers to run for office, to write books, to accept awards that turned people into icons and then used those icons as shields. Instead, he created something more enduring, the King Foundation for Civic Defense and Public Accountability. It wasn't a building or a name on a plaque. It was a system, mobile legal clinics, trauma-informed advocacy centers, and a mentorship program connecting veterans with at-risk youth. His focus was clear: prevention, education, and restoration. In a final televised interview 1 year after the verdict, the interviewer asked him if he had finally found peace. Darius paused, considered the weight of the question, then answered with quiet strength. Peace isn't a destination. It's a responsibility. You don't arrive at it. You fight to maintain it, every day, for the people who can't fight back. That response echoed across screens, classrooms, and courtrooms. It became more than a quote, it became a mantra for a generation relearning what justice should feel like. As for the boy who once handed Darius the complaint form with his brother's name, he later became one of the first students to graduate from the Foundation's legal prep program. He stood on a stage wearing a suit and tie, gripping his certificate with hands that no longer trembled with fear, but with purpose. He told the crowd, "I used to think justice was a word. Now I know it's a decision. And today, I choose it." Emerson was transferred to a federal facility far from Georgia. No visitors. No press. Just a number and a history that would follow him longer than any sentence. Some said he still believed he'd done the right thing, that he had protected order. Others said he broke in silence. But Darius never wasted time wondering. That part of the story was over. On a quiet Sunday morning, Darius stood at the same bench where he once watched his city forget his name, long before they cheered it. The city looked different now, not fixed, but moving. There were murals of faces once forgotten. Programs that hadn't existed a year ago. Young people who spoke with fire in their voices. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. A little girl passed him and pointed, whispering something to her mother. The woman smiled and nodded. That was legacy. Not in monuments, but in memories people choose to keep alive. And now, to you who watched this story unfold, let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself, how many Darius Kings have sat in silence while the world looked away? How many times has power gone unchecked, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't believe they could change anything? This story isn't about one courtroom or one city. It's about the moments when someone chooses not to walk away. When someone stands up, knowing full well they'll be knocked down, but does it anyway. It's about what happens when truth isn't just spoken, but acted on. When the fight for justice becomes bigger than the person fighting. So now, I ask you, what part of the system around you needs someone brave enough to speak? What truth are you holding that might set others free? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of this conversation. Because that's how change begins, with someone refusing to be quiet. And if stories like this move you, if they remind you of the power we hold together, then I invite you to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, join the community, and be here for the next chapter. Because around here, we don't just tell stories, we tell the ones that matter.